Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor, Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Our featured guest today is Marty Gervais. Marty Gervais is perhaps the most well-known figure in the Windsor writing community. He is an award-winning Canadian journalist, poet, playwright, historian, photographer, and editor. He won Toronto's Harbourfront Festival Prize for his contributions to Canadian letters and to emerging writers, and he was awarded the Milton Acorn People's Poetry Award. He was also awarded the City of Windsor's Mayor's Award for Literature, and he is Windsor's Poet Laureate Emeritus. He received an honorary Doctor of Laws from Assumption University in 2010. Gervais has written more than a dozen books of poetry, 2 plays, and a novel. His most successful work, The Rumrunners, is a book about the Prohibition period and was a Canadian bestseller in 1980 and was number 10 on the Globe and Mail's nonfiction bestsellers list. His most recent book is the poetry collection The Sky Above. It's an engaging book that follows his long and colorful career of spinning stories. We recorded the launch of The Sky Above to share with you. It was held at Biblioasis and hosted by Andre Narbonne and Kaylee Chapman. Following are excerpts from the launch. Our episode begins with Marty reading his poem, Breathing Sweet Hope, and continues with Marty in conversation with Andre and Kaylee. Now, here's Marty Gervais.
Breathing Sweet Hope. I sit in my car by the side of the road, watch the combine shave this field of winter wheat, golden and flat under a dreamy, dark summer sky. I am going to make some changes. That farmer will be my grandfather. He will float over this landscape, straw hat, coveralls, pipe clenched in his teeth, and I will have him wave to me from where I sit at the road's edge. I will shift the barns and chicken coop and outhouse closer to the house, haul out the wagons, and have my grandfather lead the workhorses into the farmyard. I will put back the oak trees cut down years ago in that empty pasture where we picnicked after church. I will be 6 again, lumber in a summer storm, and hurry my grandmother across the yard to shut the enormous barn doors against wind and rain. I will put laughter back into her mouth as she scoops up my limp body that has collapsed abruptly because the sky has erupted into sudden thunder. I will paint reflections in her glasses that show wind-swept trees and spooked barn owls as we race back to the house. I will exchange the words in my grandfather's frown as he stands by the back steps to tell my mother, who has driven an hour in the still dark morning, to hear him say, "Ta mère est morte." Instead, my grandmother will be in the kitchen, loading the wood stove and turning to my mother and holding her for that instant. I will stop time here and now to move all these pieces into place, the perfect farm life in this imagined game. I will open the eyes of those I love and breathe sweet hope into their limbs and words. I will let prayers finally have their day.
Well, it's a brief place to start. 60 poems covering 52 years. Why did we start here?
I think it's one of the most important poems I've ever written, actually. It sort of sets into motion what I do with a poem or when I take a photograph, or when I do anything artistic. I think an artist has all the elements and they're moving the furniture around until they find something that actually works. And I think moving it around gives you a better vision. It's all about imagining, the things not as they are, but as you would like them to be. And that's what happens in the poem. And also, when my mother told me that story when I was so very young, and I remember the words in French, "ta mère est morte." And I remember how I reacted to it, and I kept repeating it to myself over and over again. And I remember my mother telling me exactly how that happened when she walked in, and she had to go up just 2 stairs to go up to the landing to the kitchen, and my grandfather, my Pepe, telling her their mother is dead. And that was haunting as a child. And so I think what happens is when I'm writing anything or taking photographs, you move things around.
Just want to observe that you begin with geography, an external geography. The geography becomes dreamy, and then all of a sudden the landscape is within. You start positioning yourself as a child within it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When I was a young boy, I did a lot of listening. I came from a family of storytellers, and so my grandfather was always coming up with some crazy story and I didn't care whether it was actually true or not. It was just so interesting to listen to. And then my mother as well, telling stories about growing up on a farm. What a crazy thing to do. You haunt a little kid who's like 6 years old, and you're telling this kid about poultry, my German grandmother, and saying how she came back from the dead in the form of a poltergeist, with the cupboard doors slapping and teacups flying around.
Picturing your house?
Yeah, I have this picture. It's this huge picture. It was in the original frames. Both my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, they took those pictures and they put them in the attic in the farmhouse, and they were gone. So I rescued them and I put them up in my house. And my mother had not seen these since she was a little girl. And she walked into my house and she just froze. And she was shaking when she saw the picture of the German grandmother, because she was the one that came back in the form of a poltergeist. And I don't know, who knows whether any of this happens, but that picture fell from the hook on the wall, landed on the floor, and then my wife decided to move the picture and turn it to face the wall. And it was a beautiful sunny day. She turned the picture, put it against the wall, and suddenly the clouds start coming in, black clouds everywhere on a beautiful, open, sunny day. And start to rain. So my daughter said, maybe we should turn the picture around. So I turned it out, and everything cleared up. Honest to God, true story. I'm not being like my grandfather, hanging it up. Part of it, what I've just told you, is true.
That's the thing about you. I never know if the story you're telling is real or if you've played.
Just go with it.
Yeah.
It's go with it, because if you hear the story many times, it's always the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Speaking of which, I heard that story when I had the pleasure of we having tea at your place, and you told me the story about. Well, it gave me shivers.
She's kind of a severe-looking woman, isn't she?
Serious for sure.
Yeah.
Severe as it. But your walls, they're covered. I don't think there is any piece of his wall that doesn't have a photograph or a piece of art on it.
That's true.
You really pay attention to space. And I think that's something that you also explore in this collection is space and time and moving through childhood and photography. And I'm curious, why is photography so important to you? Why have you covered all of your walls in it and captured all these moments?
I have a great love for images. And when I was a young kid, my dad used to have coming to the house the Toronto Telegram, the Toronto Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Aurelia Packet Times, all these newspapers, and I used to cut pictures out all the time and put them in scrapbooks, and with no particular theme. But I always loved looking at pictures, and whenever I write, I think visually. I try to paint a picture, and sometimes I'll put up a photograph that I've taken, and I won't frame it. I'll just put it up against the mantle, and I do that purposely to see whether I'm still interested in looking at it a week later, 2 weeks later, or several months later. And when I look at a picture, I imagine a story unfolding before me. Mm. And I think that's, in some ways, what brought me to writing in the first place.
So would you say the photograph comes first, or the writing does?
The visual comes first, yeah, absolutely. I go to Tim Hortons at 4:30 in the morning. And when I go there, I stand outside and I look through the windows to see who's there. And I'm visually snapping a photograph. Sometimes I've actually taken photographs. I like looking at, standing outside and looking through those windows. And sometimes looking through those windows is foggy. And so it becomes an abstract picture that I'm looking at. And then I can make up whatever story I want. Well, there's a poem called Shooting Dogs. This goes back to when I was working for the Chatham Daily News. And I was working out in the county, and my neighbors wanted me to come along on a little trip around the neighborhood to shoot coyotes. I didn't want to shoot them, but I jumped in the pickup truck and I got with them. I did that partly because I was interested in seeing what they were going to do, and also I was doing it as an assignment and writing, for the paper about it and taking pictures. I never could shoot the coyotes, though I joined my neighbors who trekked and hunted them down through windswept winter fields of Essex County. I rode with those farmers in the cab of bumpy, smoky pickups, windows wide open, rifles tucked beside, and the trucks racing along concession roads as we drove, herding those coyotes across stubble fields. I watched these hunters pile out of their trucks to file alongside the road, lined up like soldiers. Cold rifles trained on coyotes, and one by one these doomed creatures rushed into their gun sights, tumbling and squealing. But one coyote sped between the lineup, raced past the trucks into the open flats and beyond. As the farmers followed, each raising his rifle, but the wind was strong and they let that brush wolf go, and I watched it disappear into the far-off snowy fields horizon, running for all its life, never once looking back. When I turned around, I saw the men lighting up cigars, rifles balanced on forearms, celebrating their victory before moving into the late windy afternoon to collect the kill and toss each carcass into the bed of their pickups. Later, I stopped by a neighbor's barn, surprised to see these stiff-bodied coyotes dangling from hooks, and photographed them for the paper, and heard startling tales of how these animals raided chicken coops, dragged off family pets, you name the harm they'd done. And I snapped a dozen pictures, moving in and out and around through the cold barn, half listening to the chatter among the men drinking beer, and thought, I'm really no better. I'm shooting coyotes too. And finally, I left. Just as daylight faded and hopped into my car, felt it shudder and then start, and I headed home to a spit-gray, cold January sky, daydreaming, feeling low. And I was maybe a half a mile from my place, and I started fiddling with the radio to tune in the news, when out of the corner of my eye, there was a coyote crouching at the edge of the ditch. I stopped. I lowered my window, and the lone coyote didn't budge. I studied his narrow, elongated snout, lean body, bushy tail, thick fur, and his yellow eyes. And I dared not to take his pictures. Nice.
Thank you.
Because that's a true story.
You can actually, remembering now, I said the Chatham Daily News, but it was actually the Windsor Star. I just made the transition from one paper to the other. So there are pictures. If you go back in the archive, you'll be able to find that. When you're writing a news story, it has to be bereft of any feelings. And it was obvious I took pictures because there were the pictures like coyotes.
So the picture not taken becomes the poem.
Yes, and it was a little yanked. For sure.
Saying about time. A lot of these poems in the collection deal with time. They deal with time on very different levels. Sometimes two people are experiencing time in different ways in the course of a single poem. I'm really interested in the motel poem and what happens there.
Should I read it?
I would like you to.
Okay, the poem is called "The Motel on Main Street." When I was 11, my parents packed up everything and they moved from Windsor, Riverside actually, and they moved up to Bracebridge, which is about 100 miles north of Toronto. It's a lovely cottage country. And my dad, his job brought him there. And the town had about 2,900 people. And we moved to a house right on the main street. And that house is still there. And there was a motel, like literally a half a block away. And as a boy, I would sit in the library of a house that we were in, and I could see the motel. And I always wanted to stay in that motel. And this is why. I was 12 years old when this happened. I was nearly 12, and I wandered by the U-shaped motel that sat on the main drag like an old aunt refusing to bid goodbye. I was taking a shortcut through the parking lot and making my way to a friend's when I noticed a door ajar in one of the units. Sudden blur in the gloom of that room. A single light, partly silhouetting a woman slipping on a summer dress over her head and down over bra and panties, hands smoothing out the cotton, momentarily looking up and spotting me, standing stock still in the lot. I want to think she smiled and turned, escaping into the darkness of the room. I continued on my way to my friends, but I never forgot that instant. Tonight, now 73 years old, I shuffle into the cramped motel office, and I check in, and I ask for room 106. And the hotel keeper hands me the key. I sit on the edge of the bed, coat and hat still on, slumped before a mirror. Why am I here? Maybe it's to gather that moment into a bouquet of darkness, of light, of beauty, something fraught and forsaken, and suddenly she is there. Or is that simply a mere gesture of trailing light from a passing car? Yet she is here, sitting beside me, leaning over to slip on her shoes, saying goodbye. Summer is long past, and all of her now in a silhouette, brightening into a whisper of light.
Now, we all know Marty will tell a good story, but he also knows how to get things done. A couple weeks ago, a month ago now maybe, I was in Toronto with my fiance, and we were on our way back home to Windsor. And my fiance has this thing where he thinks he sees everybody he knows, and he goes, "Is that Marty?" And I turn, and there's Marty at the Via Rail and taking the same train back to Windsor. We're not sitting in the same place, obviously. So we say goodbye, whatever. We sit down in our different cars. And then I open my phone. I've missed 3 calls from Marty. And then suddenly he's right there. He's like, I've got us a seat. I went, what? So we go 2 cars down. And this guy has managed to finagle a 4-seater, which they don't give out like that, for us all to sit together. But I never doubt when Marty wants something, he's gonna get it done. And I think you share that through your stories as well. These, like the one that you just read, when you wanted something, you found a way to make it happen.
As I say, I always wanted to go there. And what happened in this case, I was on my way to do a reading in Barrie, Ontario, and I did the reading. It was an afternoon reading, and I decided to just drive up to Bracebridge. I didn't have anything booked. And I thought, well, why not stay in this motel? And I did bring back my wife to that motel about several months later, and she wasn't very impressed.
So how old were you when you left Bracebridge? Because so many of these poems take place there.
I left Bracebridge right out of high school, actually, so I just was 18 years old.
And yet these poems are filled with that experience. The child is never far from these poems.
Yeah.
So then your friend John B. Lee, when I read his poems, I think, okay, I'm in the country. Even if it's in the city, the country's there. And with your poems, I think the child is here. The child is present in his poems.
Absolutely. It was a different experience living there. In Windsor, I was going to a Catholic school, which was basically across the street. I was involved in the church there as well as an altar boy. In Bracebridge, there was much more of a situation where we could run all over town. Like the whole town was like very compact. Whereas in Riverside, if you wanted to go to a movie, well, the Center Theater was there, but mostly you'd have to go downtown. And so, by the age of 11, I didn't really venture beyond my neighborhood, but in Bracebridge, I could go all over the place.
What's the population when you're growing?
At that time, it was 2,900.
Okay.
And we moved to a house, which was one of the biggest houses in the town. And that was different for us because I lived in a cramped little house on Prado in Windsor. Everything was different. But going to Bracebridge, I had my own room. I had an attic, actually. And from that attic, I could see all the way down the street, and I could see what everyone was doing. And I got into a lot of trouble because I started asking my father all kinds of questions about people in the town. And like, for example, the woman next door, the man and the woman lived next door, the man would leave the house every morning to go to work at 9:15. And at 9:30, Mr. Thomas, the optometrist, would arrive, and he'd stay for about 45 minutes. So I said to my father, I said, is Mrs. So-and-so, does she have really bad eyes? And because, he's over there a lot. And he told me, he said, mind your own business. But I was always asking questions and getting into trouble. I was always curious. And Bracebridge really brought out a lot of that in me.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I could read another poem from Bracebridge if you want.
Yeah, please.
This poem is called The Hockey Equipment. The one thing in Windsor, I never played hockey except road hockey and table hockey. Never was on skates. So I went to Bracebridge, and my new friends, was trying to impress them with things. So they said to me, well, do you play hockey? And I said, yeah, of course. Yeah. First play hockey. Well, how many goals did you score last year? 90. 90 goals? God. So anyway, the word got around. Everyone knew that the Gervais kid scored 90 goals last year. I wasn't even on a hockey team. I was counting table hockey. So when it came time to try out for the travel team, I showed up with equipment, and the coach said, you don't need to try out. 90 goals? You're on the team. You're on the first line. I'd never been on skates. So I showed up at the first practice. I fell flat on my ass, and I was the laughingstock of town. Everybody knew that story, 90 goals. So this is about the equipment that I actually wore. I sat near the back step of the apartment just above the bank, and I tried on the equipment. Shin pads, shoulder pads, elbow pads. The bank manager's wife stood there watching me and said I could have them. They had been her son's, and she was just going to throw them out if I didn't take them. I lugged the bag home that night up Main Street to my house, and I dumped it out on the basement floor and tried it all on again in silence, but for the hum of the coal furnace. That winter, I played my heart out, trying to make the travel team, and didn't, and wound up playing early Saturday mornings with boys as bad at hockey as I was. I remember noticing the bank manager's wife coming out a few mornings to watch. She just sat at one end of the arena under the advertisement for the dry goods store, same spot a couple or 3 Saturdays in a row. And then I didn't see her again. All winter I wondered about why she had come, and wondered about her son and whatever happened to him, whether he ever made the hockey team. I couldn't remember his name, though she must have told me. I couldn't think of what it was, or where was he anyway. I was new to town, and I didn't know the stories, the families, except for my new friends. And maybe I scored a few goals, and by the end of March I was packing away the equipment in the basement, and I thought of her son again, and finally I asked a buddy of mine, and he told me 2 winters before I moved to town, their son had fallen through the ice on the south branch of the river playing hockey, and had been on the travel team, a goal scorer. They had hands like Jean Beliveau, and he was 15 years old. and the Bracebridge Bears were looking to sign him next season. The next winter, when I opened the bag, the embarrassment was overwhelming of how badly I had played the winter before, and how the boy's mother sat there all those Saturday mornings in hope of catching the grace and glory of a son she no longer had. This poem is really about falling short of expectations when all you're doing is playing a game that you love and everyone's expecting you to be better and to do better. I did finally learn to skate. And, you know, I look at my life now. I have 2 grandsons who are, one is playing for the Saginaw Spirit, and they won the Memorial Cup earlier this year. And his brother plays for the University of Guelph and was on a team that went to like a Canada Cup for Junior A. That was also in June, I think. And I have a son who's living in Montreal and is now the strength and conditioning coach for the Montreal Canadiens. I don't think it was in my genes. I think it was in my wife's side of the family. And her father was in the aerial acts in the circus, and he was very athletic. So, very cool.
Cool.
This is one of your poems where 2 people are in the same place having vastly different experiences. This is one of the things that seem to happen in your poetry.
Yeah.
The mother, the grieving mother.
Yeah, well, absolutely, sure.
And then you with your intense experience, the moment. And this is one of the marks of your poetry, I think, is that the reality is multiple in the poems.
Yeah, I think that was because I pick up on the sensitivities of it. When I was a kid, I don't think I realized right away. I mean, obviously, I didn't realize why she was there. Mm-hmm. And it was only when I opened my hockey bag that it just came back at me in a rush. That's what this was all about. And now that I knew the whole story, I was always a curious kid, always asking questions, and then taking those answers and expanding upon those answers.
So the story you tell about it is about you, but is the poem about you, or is the poem about her?
I think it's probably about her.
That's what I think. I think it's a sad one.
Yeah. It is a sad poem, and I've never actually read that publicly until today. So
there was a great silence after you finished.
Yeah.
We all weren't sure if to clap because I think we all felt that same tension of the ending of that story.
I think partly because I was living in this town, as I say, everyone knew everybody else, and you kind of knew their backstories, and it was more intimate. As I was growing up, hearing their stories from my friends or hearing it from them directly, I used to go and talk to a war veteran from Denmark, and I used to go and sit in the afternoons and just listen to him and talk with him, and he'd tell me all these war stories, and I was just so interested in it. And if I wasn't doing that, I was actually doing a lot of reading. I remember my mother scolding me, lying on the back porch reading a book, and she's telling me, "Put that book down. This is not good for you. You know, get outside in the sunshine." And I said, "Well, there's sunshine coming through the windows, and I can do both." And I don't need to go outside. I mean, now, of course, you have kids, you hope they're going to read other than a phone.
Yeah.
You know, so, yeah.
Well, moving from childhood into your teenage years, you have a poem in your collection called Summer in Detroit. I'd love to hear a little bit of that backstory.
In my basement, I have an old Detroit Olympia chair. That seat was actually in the old Windsor Arena because they bought a lot of the seats from the Olympia. The poem is really about the chair, and I'll just read the poem and you can see. Summer in Detroit. A flimsy wooden seat from Detroit's old Olympia, bought for $25, is the closest thing I have to the Beatles. It once played in that arena in 1964 and again in 1966. And I think of my friend who remembered it was nearly midnight when the Beatles' Greyhound bus pulled away from the Olympia, and he could hear Fab Four singing Long Tall Sally as teenage girls rushed into the street to trail after the bus. Cleveland bound. It was an all-nighter. And someone said they heard their laughter, saw them wave from the open windows a humid August night, swear they tossed their cufflinks to frantic, stretched-out hands. My 18-year-old high school buddy had skipped class that day to hang out at the Whittier Hotel downtown, and he dialed all day long a radio station so he could win 1 square inch of the sheets Lennon slept on. I don't know if any of it is true. I don't care. The broken-down seat from the Olympia rests in a corner of my basement, and I'm struggling to find some kind of metaphor for how I should feel, some lyric moment for this brush with greatness as I sit down on that wooden chair, the hum of the furnace and the silence of a summer afternoon. But this is nothing to compare with the postage stamp-sized remnant from John Lennon's bed that sits in a dresser drawer in an envelope from the radio station. I swear I could hear someone sleeping.
Thank you. No, I'd like to think of this next poem. You end the entire collection with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's called The Art of Writing. What is the art of writing to you?
The poem is, well, I'll just show you this cover, by the way, is a photograph that was taken by Linda Gadieu. It's an amazing photograph. When I saw the picture, it was on Facebook, and I wrote to Linda and I asked her, I'd like to use this on a cover of my book. They already had a cover in mind. It was just a photograph I had taken, but I thought this would be better. It inspired this poem, and the poem is really about writing. On the surface, the poem is really about a guy out fishing. I'm a boy with my brother, and I'm casting my line out, hoping to pull in something. But writing is like that. It's any kind of art is like that. It takes patience. It takes faith. Time and time again, you cast out that line, and you hope you pull in that moment that brings in all the deepest mysteries of the moment. When I look at when I look at the novel by Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, and it's really a prose poem, the whole thing. It was published in, I think, Life magazine. I actually have a copy of the original Life magazine, and the whole novel was published there. But Hemingway said it wasn't. But when you read it, it's like a metaphor for finding the right line, the right words to say, to convey something. And to me, this is what the poem is about. I can read the poem. That morning in the spring, we had to be the only ones on the lake, with a swarm of clouds in the sky above like a brooding mother gathering us into her warmth. I was too busy maybe to notice as I carefully threaded my fishing line, all the while the solitary aluminum boat, ever hushed, dipped in rhythmical pace to the silent sway of the dark water. And my older brother's voice soon broke out across the lake, echoing precise instructions for my initiation into this artful practice of angling smallmouth bass. I'm not sure I heard him as I spun out a line like a run-on sentence with nowhere to go but into the cool air, cherishing only the reckless wish for those green and black takings to leap from the deep mysteries of the sleeping lake. And yet nothing, and nothing, as the sun elbowed its way past billowy, stubborn clouds to lift us into its presence, and still nothing. I'm not sure if I even cared now. My thoughts gradually lured away by the smooth and mirrored lake with its gallery of stately trees and clouds, when suddenly the line twitched and stiffened and pulled and tugged again, and I began to reel furiously, all certainty fixed in that instant, and there it was, the glory of a pumpkin seed sunfish hurling itself into the cool air, its oily, wavy blue-green stripes catching the first light of day with unexpected splendor and luck and innocence. In that moment, I was sure about everything. Thank you. This is something I learned from Morley Callahan when he was the writer-in-residence in 1971 at the University of Windsor. And what I learned from him was, like, you'll notice the endings have a little bit of a surprise. And that's something that he encouraged me to do with the writing. It's almost in a certain kind of way a journalistic thing as well. So you have a good beginning, setting the tone, but to leave the reader with a little bit of a surprise at the end. That's something I learned in 1971, and I learned it because I was writing some poems about the farm back then, and that's what really, really attracted Callahan to my work. A really good friend of his was Raymond Caneister, and Raymond Caneister was an up-and-coming poet in the 1920s and 1930s, publishing in Paris and all over the world. And he wrote about the farm. And so Callahan told me about him and said, you should read his work. Yours is very much like that. But that's one of the things I reflect on. Ironically, now, all these years later, I'm the writer-in-residence at the University of Windsor for this month. So I'm sitting in the same spot in some ways where I was all those years ago. And it was just ironic.
Thank you all for coming to our reading interview celebration of this book and the work of Marty Gervais. I hope you will stay to buy copies maybe and talk to Marty. And
as Marty wrote in my book, now open your eyes to the sky above. Open.
Thank you, Collie. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.